Alrighty, hello everybody. We are few but mighty here in person. We got 3, 4 if you count me. I do see there's quite a few of you on Zoom, so I'm gonna take a minute to check everybody in, and then we'll go from there. Just gonna open up my participant list because that'll be a lot easier. Perfect. And for those of you just joining, I'm just taking a sec to take attendance here. Nothing is wrong with your volume. I am just making sure I get everybody. Okie dokie. So as we were talking about right before I start, there is not much time left into the semester at this point in time. So be thinking about getting those perusals done. Be thinking about your poster. Some people never turn in their topic for that. So, do your topic, do your outline, and be working on that poster because it is due in just a few weeks. Exam 3, I started grading, but I haven't gotten very far. I hope to finish that either tonight or tomorrow so I can pass it back on Wednesday. Reminder, we do have class Wednesday, but we do not have it Friday because I will be in Seattle for the meeting of the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, which is my big conference every year. So, use that time as you need it, whether it's to work on stuff for this class, stuff for another class, sleeping, whatever you need the most, honestly, use it for that. And yeah, what we're going to start talking about today is everyday living. I'm going to go ahead and share screen. Make sure I share the sound with y'all. There we go. So we have this chapter, and then our last chapter is kind of a wrap up of everything we've talked about this semester. So again, not much time left, not much material left. We're getting to the end of the semester, which of course is good because that means the holidays are around the corner, but also can be not great because it means you all have a lot of work to do, which means I also will have a lot of grading. As a reminder, although we don't have class Friday, we do have class next Monday. Thanksgiving break doesn't start till Wednesday. So I think every year that sort of creeps further and further back, but we will in fact have class. Alrighty, so we're going to be thinking today about how psychology can help folks in everyday living. So sort of taking a lot of what we've done this semester is sort of criticizing how things have been portrayed, thinking about critical thinking, and it's kind of negative, right? A lot of what we talk about in this class is sort of negatively balanced. And in fact, what we do a lot in psychology is think about how we can take the knowledge we have and apply it to improve people's lives. And so that's what this chapter is about. And so this first video is just thinking about that, thinking about how do you take psychology and apply it to your day-to-day life. Particularly, I know in some of our classes, it just feels very pulled back, right? It feels like we're talking about very abstract concepts and we're not always talking about how they relate to things.
My name is Mohan. I was enrolled in the Bachelor of Science Honours Psychology course at MDIS.
My name is Muhammad Umar Marikan, and I am currently pursuing the higher diploma in psychology at MDIS.
I am Abirami.
So just real quick, as with a lot of these videos, they end up being a sort of advertisement for whoever made them. Bear with that for a couple seconds because they're going to get into the applicable information quickly.
And I took the Bachelor of Science Honours degree program.
I took up the full-time program. I am a full-time technician, working the night shift and a father. From my point of view, this helps me to achieve a healthy work-life balance, to work, study, and have time for my family. If I were to take up a part-time program, I am afraid that I won't be able to manage my course timetable.
I really enjoyed the clinical psychology module because it allowed me to compare different therapeutic approaches to mental illness. I also enjoyed the independent research module because it allowed me to choose an area of research that I was interested in, and it also gave me freedom to choose my own methodology, whatever I liked for that research.
It will be the most sought after profession as psychology is involved and required in some way or another in most companies and industries. And it also shows the importance of psychology as it is relevant in one way or another.
And that point is so important. And I can just give you an example of it. So we used to have a class here called First Year Experience. It's been replaced by West 100 in a lot of ways. But one of the things we used to do with that class is we would assign the incoming first years all to read the same book. And then during orientation, we'd have an interdisciplinary panel to discuss the themes of the book. And there was almost always, if not every year I've been here, a psychologist on that panel because it is relevant to everything. It is relevant to any sort of nuanced behavior you want to talk about. And so that's one of the most important and applicable things about psychology is that it's interwoven into our lives.
Furthermore, the need for psychologists, counselors, or even social workers has increased drastically in recent times after COVID-19 as well.
So mental health is becoming a huge priority because this has been underlined by COVID-19. There's been an explosion of mental illness during this time. And this is probably the tip of the iceberg. There's going to be a lot more. We're just seeing the beginnings of this. There's also other problems like social media has negative effects. We're also seeing the breakdown of meaningful community support that causes psychological alienation. You've also got technology like AI, making people lose their jobs and also their sense of purpose. So those are all going to have effects, and psychology is going to need to evolve to address all those challenges.
Psychology is a fascinating study of the human mind, social behaviors, and cognitive processes. It is useful in understanding oneself and others, and the knowledge acquired will most certainly be of immense benefit to individuals. I would therefore encourage those who have a keen interest to pursue it.
So just thinking about some of the ways that psychology can apply to day-to-day life, and certainly I know y'all can think of plenty more, and probably ways you've used the knowledge you've gotten in our courses, right, in different ways. And so what this chapter does and what we're going to do in here is pick up some examples that are pretty key. And the first one that we're going to address is explanatory style, which is the way in which we explain our behavior and the events we experience. So we typically think of this as like internal versus external, but it's also having to do with how stable or unstable we think the causes are, and also whether it relates to that particular situation, or we think of it as something that affects us more globally. And so this, I think, is one of the best examples I've ever seen. This is from my adult psychopathology book. and it talks about these as attributions instead of explanatory styles. Same thing. But the idea is that, again, we can have this internal, external axis, this global and specific axis, and the stable and unstable axis. And depending on which we sort of use the most, internalize the most, it's going to affect how we feel about ourselves and how we feel about the world around us. So they give the example of failing a psychology test, right? And so if we're thinking this is internal, this is something about me that caused me to fail this test. If it's stable and global, we're saying this is something that can't change, and global means it's going to apply to all situations. So stable, I have a problem with test anxiety. And then if we got stable but more specific, we would just say, this is related to psychology. I just have no grasp of psychology, right? And there are people who feel that way, or who might feel that way about different topics, different subjects, right? This is how I felt about chemistry in college, but other people loved it and got it like this, right? So if we're making an internal, again, still saying it's something wrong with me, but unstable attribution, and let's say we're going to do a global one, getting into an argument with my roommate threw my whole day off, right? So it wasn't just the test, it was my whole day. But we can also have internal, again, something about me, unstable. It's about sort of this moment, and specific. I got upset and froze when I couldn't answer the first two questions. And that certainly has happened to the best of us, right? On an exam where you're just like, I'm just going to fail this, right? You can also, however, say, it's not my fault at all. It's stuff outside of me, right? And sometimes that's the truth, right? And sometimes it's probably a mix, right? But an external, again, global, applying across multiple situations, stable one would be that written tests are an unfair way to assess knowledge. There's starting to be more and more research suggesting that's true, actually, which is why I give you all take-home exams. Unstable version of that would be no one does well on tests that are given the day after vacation. Probably true, right? It could be external, stable, and specific. Everyone knows that this particular professor enjoys giving unfair tests. Or it could be external, unstable, and specific. This professor didn't put much thought into the test when they were writing it, basically, because of the pressure of her book deadline. And that might be true, right, in certain scenarios. So what we find is that when you sort of combine these, you can have pessimistic versus optimistic styles. So a pessimistic style is it's external, it's specific, and it's unstable for positive events. So a positive event happened to me because of some fluke of that situation, not because I did anything right or that, you know, in general, the world's going to be okay. An optimistic perspective would be external, specific, and unstable for negative events. Sort of a, this will pass, this is a one-time thing, it'll be okay going forward. What we see in clinical psychology, and we talk about quite a bit, is a depressive style, where it's internal, stable, and global. So here, you know, it's not that much getting down on yourself, right? It's more stating a fact. I have a problem with test anxiety. But for someone with depression, this might be more, I never do well on anything, so why would I have expected to do well on this exam, right? And so they're blaming themselves, they're saying it's stable, they're saying it's every scenario. And as you can imagine, when that's the way that you look at the world, it's really, really hard to like have optimism, to feel good about yourself. And so what happens in depression is it becomes sort of self-perpetuating because of this style. And so a lot of what we work on in therapy with these folks is starting to question that and think about other explanations for events. And so this is a little bit about optimism versus pessimism.
We're in New York City in Union Square.
And we're just out in the streets here finding out if people are optimists or pessimists. How are you folks doing?
Do I have to catch anything?
No, no. Okay. Would you say that you're an optimist or a pessimist?
Well, it certainly depends on the day. I've never taken that question seriously.
I would say I'm an optimist,
An optimist.
for sure.
I would say I'm a pessimist, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do you think that affects your day-to-day life?
I think it slows me down a little bit.
I'm an optimist.
You're an optimist.
Definitely an optimist.
And why would you say that?
But just look around you.
It's beautiful out.
Yeah.
You know, not a cloud. There's hardly a cloud in the sky.
I'm alive. I'm here with you guys.
Yeah.
Can you think of one time when it was harder to be an optimist?
Jeez.
Last semester, I was doing a bio class, biology, right? And first 2 tests, I completely failed.
I lost both of my parents at a very young age.
You know, my life was headed in the wrong direction. A lot of depression. I've been in a wheelchair for 19 years, so.
Maybe every time I was scraping by, wondering what I was going to eat for the next meal.
So I slept on the floor on a towel for like 3 weeks, and then was like saving up to buy a bed. But it got better.
There's always something good to look forward to. No matter what situation you're in.
When you get that meal, there you go. It doesn't have to be that you win the lottery. Something small is still that much important.
My life experience showed me that being a pessimist and being desperate brings to nothing.
And there are definitely days where I have to remind myself, like, take advantage of your time here.
My wife had cancer and I took care of her for 5 years. We used to travel with her cancer, and the reason was because we always thought that it's going to be better. Of course, cancer could kill, and it killed her, but we enjoyed life to the fullest.
Bad situations, they might seem like bad situations because of what I was taught.
That's a really good time to sort of try to flip it and think about what you've got to be grateful for.
But like, at least I have, my sight, my feelings, my hearing.
Now I'm working as a software developer. I went from just, scraping by to where I am now.
I have a 98-year-old grandmother who's an eternal optimist.
Yeah.
I think it's how she's stayed healthy and happy.
That's what's good about being an optimist, is you can always look ahead. Enjoy the present as opposed to lamenting it. And if you don't like your present, change your present. That's why it's the future.
Thank you so much for watching.
And so that was from the t-shirt company Life is Good, right? So clearly it's an ad focusing on optimism. But I did like how they showed folks who had gone through really bad situations, right? And they found ways to be optimistic through that. And there was sort of their attribution, their way they were looking at things, their explanatory style that helped them to get through those really tough times. So there is a caveat here, and that is unrealistic optimism, which is a belief that you'll experience more positive outcomes in life compared to others. So this is essentially what we've talked about before in terms of everyone thinking they're above average, right? It's just not statistically possible, right? Even in the absence of any kind of objective reasons for such belief, right? And you can imagine how unrealistic optimism may even turn pathological or become more narcissism, right? I'm great, I'm wonderful, therefore I'm going to get all this stuff coming to me. And related is the Pollyanna principle, which is an outlook on life characterized by unrelenting optimism regarding the future and an unwillingness to accept failure. So that doesn't have to be bad, right? That is more about sort of what one of those guys at the end was saying. It's about sort of creating your own best path forward, right? Rather than kind of waiting for the world to do it for you. And that's why explanatory style is so important, right? If you think this is global and stable and there's nothing I can do to change things, you won't make any effort to try to better your life, right? And so figuring out those ways can be really important. And so the anecdote here is that Martin Seligman, who is one of the biggest names in positive psychology. Positive psychology is just what it sounds like. It's the study of positive aspects of human existence. It's the study of how to sort of help people make their lives better. And he detailed an ABC perspective, which is adversity, belief, consequence, right? So he said, when you run into adversity, it doesn't automatically result in a certain consequence. It is your belief about the event that actually reflects what consequence will come as a result of it. So consider, he suggested, an adverse event, such as your best friend has stopped returning your calls. And so he said, your belief or interpretation about why this has happened, you know, if you think my friend just doesn't like me anymore, then that will lead to the consequence of your belief. So you'll become depressed because of your thought about it. So Seligman recommended you can either dispute your belief, perhaps make the argument that it's more likely your friend is just busy with schoolwork, or distract yourself by getting busy with something else, or literally for folks who have obsessive, hard to break thought patterns, there is a technique called thought stopping, where you just say to yourself, stop thinking that way. And at least temporarily, it can be effective. So Seligman argued that beliefs may or may not be true, and if they're not, then changing them can alter the consequences that you experience, or at least your interpretation of those consequences. And that can help you get rid of that pessimistic or depressive explanatory style. And so these researchers used a similar approach to change in explanatory style, using the rationale that imagery or visualization produces deep cognitive processing. So you're not only asking someone to think about something, but to like picture it in their mind. So they asked a research participant to imagine ways they could behave more positively in the future in 3 domains. So personal, relational, and professional, by coming up with positive statements for each of those domains. In the future, I will. The images created by each person contributed to the development or visualization of a best positive self. And over a 2-week period, each participant was then tasked with spending 5 minutes a day imagining their positive story. The result was sustained increases in optimism compared to participants who were in the control group. Furthermore, research has shown that the use of the best possible self technique can have health benefits. And in particular, we know that things like stress and pessimism are linked to like cardiac related diseases, heart attacks, things, high blood pressure, things along those lines. But also we know just in general that stress makes it harder for folks to heal, right? And so by using some of these psychological techniques, you can essentially give your body more ammo to fight whatever you're facing right then. So this idea of the ABC that Seligman came up with has been translated to therapy. And so in particular, Albert Ellis, one of the founding people of cognitive therapy, his type of therapy was called rational emotive therapy, came up with this ABC worksheet. So here, Seligman's sort of adversity idea is your activating event. Something happens to you. And your belief, or what Ellis sometimes called stuck points, was how you interpret that, what you tell yourself about that situation. And then your consequence is what you feel or experience as a result. So the example that I often give, and that is sort of a typical example in therapies that use this ABC sheet, is let's say you're walking down the middle of campus, you see someone you know, and you're like, hey, how's it going? And they just keep walking, right? So what are different ways you could react to that? What are beliefs you could have about why that person didn't say hi back? And folks on Zoom, feel free to chime in the chat. So like a common one folks will be like is, oh, they must be mad at me, right? And then your consequence, how do you feel if you think someone's mad at you? What's that? Go ahead, Galen. Yeah, you could feel like guilty or shame. What did I do? Yeah, or you could get mad back, right? Yeah, and 2 folks in the chat said maybe they had a bad day, right? And so if you think they have a bad day, the consequence is going to be more like empathy, right? Maybe if you're not in a hurry to wherever you're going, you turn around and you put your hand on their shoulder and say, hey, is everything okay? Right? Or you check in with them later if you are in a hurry. Yeah, good example. Another one is like, maybe they just didn't see me, right? And then what I often write this on the board when I'm doing this, but I don't know. I'm feeling extra lazy today, full disclosure, so I'm just talking through it. And then your consequence there, I usually just write meh, right? Like if you think they didn't see you, doesn't really affect you one way or the other, right? But there's a whole host of things you could think about and ways you could react as a result. And yet the vast majority of people think that whatever you're experiencing as your consequence, right, that the emotions you're feeling are directly because of your activating events. But in fact, what this theory argues is it's not that. It's your interpretation of the events that leads to those consequences. Now, the really interesting thing about this, and this is something that has a lot of research behind it, and shown that like therapy addressing this is really helpful and efficacious. But I've seen some folks online, and I get where they're coming from, who just describe this therapy as gaslighting. They're like, oh, you're just blaming it on the person. And that's not what you're trying to do. You're not saying you are the problem. You're saying our society conditions us, right, to think of things in a certain way. So instead, the way to think about it is, let's think about those things that you've been conditioned to think and help you try to think about ways that you could think about it differently, right? And so that's part of what you see here on the bottom. Ellis calls this section the D, or disputation. Are my thoughts in B realistic, right? So if you think, oh, this person hates me because they didn't say hi once, right? This gets you thinking about like, maybe that's not that realistic, right? Now, if you have a history of like you two are mortal enemies, right? Fair, right? And then you start to say, if this happened again, what can you tell yourself, right? And it's simple things like don't jump to conclusions, follow up with that person, things along those lines. And some of the things you all already said, right? It's maybe a them problem and not a you problem. Now, this is, I think, a really interesting subsection of your chapter and a really important one, because health psychology itself is one of the fastest growing fields within psychology. Places are starting to, like in my clinical program, it was like a subset of what you could do in clinical psych, is you could focus on health psychology. But a lot of places are even starting whole PhDs just in health psych now. So again, folks on Zoom, feel free to throw stuff in the chat. Folks in person, feel free to shout out answers. What are health behaviors you could think of that psychologists may be able to help people with? Things that, you know, might not be great for their health that we can help them change. Yeah, Olivia. Yeah, definitely. So worrying all the time about things you can't control is definitely something you can focus in on. But yeah, think about even just beyond that, which is so true and it affects so many health behaviors, right? But what are like basic behaviors that we tell people you shouldn't do these because they're bad for your health, that psychologists might be able to like help you change bad habits? I'm not going to leave y'all like hanging out, right? Like smoking, right? So there are psychological groups that help with smoking cessation. As an eating disorder researcher who's also steeped in weight stigma, I have to fully acknowledge that weight loss shouldn't be a goal for everybody. But for example, there are psychologically based programs for weight loss. Things to do with stress, like meditation. We can also help people to do health behaviors they should be doing. Simple things like making your doctor's appointments, right? If there's anxiety related to that, then psychologists can help folks deal with that. And then I'm not going to ask anyone to like report your own health behaviors that you struggle with, but just sort of think of that and think about how psychology might be able to help in that line. And so this next video kind of gets at an overview of health psych here.
I'm Dr. Deborah Tate, and I'm a health psychologist. You get into psychology, or at least I did, because I wanted to help people. I've moved a little bit away from doing that one-on-one to public health, where we try to develop programs that can help lots more people change and live healthier lives. I
will say that public health is a really big growing area, not only just within psychology, but as a whole. And it's something that a lot of psychology students might find really interesting. And there are different facets of public health you could focus in on. If you're interested in sort of really large scale things, you could focus in on epidemiology. Right, you could focus in on prevention. And I just learned at an event I went to last week that Norfolk State is actually starting a master's in public health with an emphasis on health disparities and health equity. So there's lots of different ways you can use things we talk about in psychology to think about public health.
Use science to understand which of the things we're trying is most effective. What's amazing is that the top leading causes of death are actually preventable. Things like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, all those kinds of chronic illnesses are preventable or treatable if we could help people to lead a healthier lifestyle. In psychology, we apply the same principles of basic science to do an experiment. We develop some research questions or hypotheses, and then we develop an intervention and apply an experimental design where you rigorously control for factors. I study two things: strategies for improving weight loss and how we can use technology to adapt face-to-face programs that are proven to be effective, put them online, and get them out to more people. Young adults in the US are gaining on average 30 pounds between the time they're 18 and 35. Young adults are also starting to have cardiovascular disease markers or risk factors like higher blood pressure and cholesterol problems earlier than prior generations. We follow them with technology. So we're using websites, cell phones, mobile web, or texting to have them keep tabs on their weight. And there's a program behind the scenes that gives them suggestions or gives them feedback. Then we have a lot of data.
And so here again is one place where I'm going to sort of step in with my research on weight stigma. For some people, losing weight is going to reduce these risk factors. For other people, it will not, because looking at this on an individual weight basis is not necessarily going to cure the things that are causing you, say, the stress that's giving you cardiovascular issues, right? So we know, for example, that people who live in poverty have higher levels of this. And people have always been like, well, that's because they're obese. But in fact, what we're finding is, not surprisingly, it is the stress of living in poverty, right? And the discrimination that you face. And so there are things we need to address on a more systemic level if we really want to implement life-changing things as a whole for folks.
And so we try to put all that together and unpack what happened and tell a story not only on whether it worked or didn't work, but how it worked. It's fun because you get to ask questions and then see whether your predictions are right or wrong, and you get to think about puzzles and complex relationships. And what's more interesting than humans and behavior and all those things that are part of what we are, but also can be applied to major real-world problems like health. What I love about my work is that in science, you can actually observe the results. We have measurable, more objective parameters, so we can see how much weight someone lost. You can see how much those programs affect people. When someone loses weight and starts to feel better and tells you that they can climb the steps without getting out of breath and they can play with their kids, it makes you feel really good that that program that you worked so hard on made them feel so much better about themselves. The work that I do is an example of science in action because we take the underlying principles from psychology and we take the scientific method and we try to solve real-world problems.
So that gives you an example of how this can focus in on health behaviors. Sorry, there we go. And then the next one is about determinants of health. So it's going to explain a little more what I was just talking about in terms of this being more of a holistic thing we need to be thinking about. And this is what a lot of health psychologists and people in public health are really focusing on now is, okay, we know from our research we've done, right, that changing one thing is not going to make everything magically better for a person. So let's pull back and look at the big picture and see what we need to be addressing.
Hi, and welcome to this video on the social determinants of health. This is a very important concept to understand because its impact on the health of individuals and of populations. We'll be taking a look at what it is, how it impacts health, and a useful framework to understand it. Take a look around you, your family, friends, and other people around you. What's clear is that health is quite variable, not just between individuals, but also across different population groups. Let's take an example. In 2015, the life expectancy of a child born in Sierra Leone was 50 years, whereas in Australia it was 83 years, a difference of 33 years. But there are differences even within countries. For example, in Australia, the life expectancy of Indigenous people is about 10 years lower than that of non-Indigenous people.
And so for folks who aren't familiar with the term Indigenous, this is essentially native peoples. So in Australia, that would be people with Aboriginal origins. And so we know that, especially due to settler colonization, right, settler colonialism, there's a lot of stress and resource depletion that has happened to these populations.
Within a population, health is also influenced by social status. People with higher income, a higher level of education, and a better occupation have better health and a greater life expectancy. Health status can change as well.
And so like part of the greater life expectancy thing and better health is because you have access to healthcare, right? I don't have to worry if something happens to me, whether I'm going to be able to pay for it, right? I have a $25 copay when I go to the doctor, and with my salary, I can afford that, right? For other people, even if they have that copay, that's not going to be feasible for them, right?
For example, studies of migrants have shown that the type of diseases, health behaviors, and risk factors are different in migrants compared to those in their country of origin. So why is there so much variability? To answer that question, we must understand the factors that can influence health. Let's have a look. A person's health is influenced by a range of factors called determinants of health. These include who they are, individual factors such as age, sex, and genetic makeup, and also what they do. This includes their health behaviors such as smoking, physical activity, alcohol use, and diet. Health is also largely influenced by the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. These include their social and community networks, the socioeconomic, cultural, and environmental conditions that people live in, and also health systems. These are collectively called the social determinants of health. The social determinants of health are ultimately shaped by the distribution of money, power, and resources at an international, national, and local level. They have a marked influence on health inequities, which is the unfair and avoidable health differences between different groups of people within countries or between countries. Now, there are many different social determinants of health, working across many levels and with complex interactions between them. So, to understand and explain how these determinants influence and interact with each other to affect health and well-being, several models or frameworks have been proposed. There are many different frameworks that do this, but let's have a look at one useful framework developed by the World Health Organization. According to this framework, there are two broad types of health determinants that influence health and can lead to health inequities. These are structural determinants and intermediary determinants. Structural determinants refer to the socio-economic and political context in which a person is born into and lives in. These include governance, how society organizes itself to make and implement decisions, economic, social, and public policies, and also the social and cultural values that communities place on health. These factors can determine and lead to the unequal distribution of material and monetary resources, which shapes a person's socioeconomic position. The socioeconomic position describes a person's place in society, which can affect their exposure, vulnerability, and outcomes to conditions that have an impact on their health. The socioeconomic position is determined by a number of factors such as education, occupation, income, gender, race or ethnicity, and social class. The socioeconomic position in turn affects the intermediary determinants of health. These include material circumstances, like the quality of housing, the financial means to buy healthy food, clothing, or other requirements for healthy living, and also the work environment. Psychosocial circumstances, like stressful living circumstances, relationships, and social support. Behavioral and biological circumstances. In addition to these, health systems have an impact on the type and quality of healthcare available to people. It also determines how easy it is for people to access health services and receive the healthcare they need.
So give you an example of this. In states where strict abortion bans have come into play, there are OBGYNs who are leaving the state or refusing to practice or deliver babies because they believe that they have been limited to the point that they can't serve their patient being the human woman or person with a uterus, right, who is carrying that. So there are whole cities or areas where there are no longer OBGYNs available, right? And so that's something I think that most people wouldn't think of as a potential consequence of these types of laws.
Social cohesion and social capital are factors that bridge the structural and intermediary determinants. They describe the willingness of people living in a community to make sacrifices and to cooperate with each other for a wider benefit. Intermediary determinants influence health and health inequities. It's also important to know that the links between these different factors are not always linear, but are complex and can go in both directions. For example, poor income and education can impact health, and also poor health can limit opportunities for people to participate in the workforce or receive education. Also, if population is...
So if you have to withdraw from college because you are always having health issues, for example, then that's going to limit your educational opportunities, which again is probably going to limit your career options, your insurance access, your health.
Affected by a lot of disease, it can have a broader impact on the socioeconomic and political context. So how can we change or influence these determinants? Addressing the social determinants of health is not an easy task. It involves identifying the structural and intermediate determinants of health and taking appropriate actions to improve them. To do this requires actions across all sectors of society and at all levels, including local, national, and international. The actions will depend on the existing socioeconomic and political context, resources that are available, and commitment for action. And that's a quick introduction to the social determinants of health. We've had a look at what it is, how it impacts health, and a useful framework to understand it.
And so, yeah, what you have access to, what you have, what you are kept away from, right, by the social determinants in your culture or your specific area where you live, can really determine the quality of life you can live, determine your health outcomes, right? And that can determine a whole host of things in terms of life expectancy, but also sort of the ability of your kids to live healthy lives, things along those lines. One of the examples I often use is food deserts. So there are places in the US, places honestly in our cities like Norfolk, where it is impossible to walk to a grocery store. The only place you could go and buy food if you don't have transportation is like a 7-Eleven, right? And I don't know if you all have ever looked at the produce at a 7-Eleven. It ain't that pretty, right? And if it's there, it's expensive, right? And so people who are impoverished will often get criticized for eating processed foods. But if you cannot access anything but that, right? If that's the only thing that is affordable, right? If you can go to McDonald's and for under $5, you can get some protein and some grain, right? And maybe even some lettuce and pickle on your sandwich, right? But you cannot do that at your convenience store or your grocery store, then people are going to do what they need to do to live, right? To fuel their bodies to get through another day. And so we in the US in particular, but Western societies in general, tend to have this like, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, you can do it philosophy. And that's just not fair when the cards are stacked against folks, right? And so looking at these social determinants of health becomes very important. And this is a place where psychologists are doing a lot of good research, sociologists are doing a lot of good research, and interdisciplinary teams in general. I mean, if anyone's really interested in this, Dr. Stoley each spring teaches a whole course on medical sociology. And I think that's so important we have that class. And so that's certainly an option if you're interested in this in the future. All right, we'll stop there for today and keep going with this lecture on Wednesday. And so thanks for being here. Thanks to folks on Zoom. Again, I hope to get your exams graded by Wednesday so that I can pass them back to you before I leave very early Thursday morning for my conference. Take care and have a good day.